By the time one insider vanished after a high-value operation, the ending had already begun. In the public version, it looked like another disappearance swallowed by a city that had learned to keep moving. Phones kept ringing. Traffic kept hissing below office windows. Men still walked into restaurants, into clubs, into back rooms, and acted as if the balance of power had not shifted at all. But inside the system, that disappearance meant something much more dangerous. Success had created exposure, and exposure had created fear. In a machine that had learned how to survive in Chicago for half a century, fear was never treated like emotion. It was treated like evidence. Someone had seen too much, spent too much, said too much, or simply stayed alive too long after becoming inconvenient. That was how the real story worked. Not as a sudden collapse, but as a tightening circle. The city could feel normal on the outside, while the men who quietly ruled part of it were already deciding who would not be seen again. The vanished figure was not important because he stood at the top. He mattered because he stood in the middle. He was the kind of man every durable criminal structure depends on and never fully trusts. Useful, informed, and close enough to the money to become dangerous the moment conditions changed. He knew who owed what, who moved what, who cleaned what, and who could be called when cash had to stop looking like cash. That kind of role makes a person valuable right up until the instant it makes him disposable. He was never the face of the operation. He was part of the wiring behind the walls, one of the people who made it possible for louder men to look untouchable in public. That was the trap. The closer he stood to the system's hidden functions, the less room he had to fail privately. A mistake by a street-level man could be punished. A mistake by an insider could expose the architecture. And architecture, once seen clearly, becomes evidence even when no paper changes hands. At the center of the fear stood the gatekeeper, the strategist, the man whose real talent was not chaos but control. Every long-running underworld survives by turning violence into administration. Orders are given quietly. Liabilities are removed without ceremony. Messages are delivered through routine, not spectacle. That is how a criminal empire can outlast headlines and prosecutions alike, by teaching everyone inside it that danger is ordinary and silence is survival. In Chicago, that logic became a method so polished it almost looked corporate from a distance. The machine did not need every participant to be brilliant, it needed them to be disciplined. It needed them to follow limits, stay unremarkable, and understand that a successful operation didn't end when the money moved. It ended only when no one could trace the movement back to the men who ordered it. That is why victory was often the most unstable moment. The bigger the score, the larger the wake. The more people touched the money, the more the whole circle became a risk field. The original operation, in the version repeated by witnesses, rivals, and later retellings, worked because it looked impossible until it was already over. It depended on insider access first, force second. Someone knew the rhythms of the place, the habits of the room, the points where routine made people careless. Timing mattered. Doors mattered. The difference between 1 minute and the next mattered. Men entered knowing exactly where to stand, who to frighten, what to control, and how quickly they had to move before panic turned into resistance. Hostages were not the point. They were a condition to be managed. Movement was the point. Cash had to leave one system and enter another before the first system could understand what it had lost. For a brief stretch, everything aligned. Access, nerve, silence, transport, disappearance. That is what made the operation look flawless in hindsight. Not that it was perfect, but that it seemed to confirm the myth the organization wanted everyone to believe, that it could reach into the center of ordinary life, empty it, and step back into the city before anyone knew where to look. But the first attempt at cleanup did not fail because of a genius investigator or a heroic betrayal. It failed because nearly every criminal machine, no matter how feared, is still vulnerable to something smaller than ambition: preventable error. a car seen where it should not have been, a face remembered one moment too long, a purchase that came too soon, a conversation repeated by someone who thought it would go nowhere. These were not dramatic cracks, they were ordinary cracks. That was what made them so dangerous. The myth of total control cannot survive contact with human sloppiness, and the moment the first usable trail appears, the whole posture of invulnerability changes. Suddenly, the system is no longer managing success, it is managing damage. That shift is decisive. Once cleanup becomes urgent, everyone involved begins making decisions under pressure, and pressure creates pattern. The same men who looked disciplined during the operation begin looking exposed after it. The same insider knowledge that enabled the score now becomes a map for anyone trying to rebuild it from the outside. Then came the lockdown phase, the part the public rarely sees because it looks so much like restraint. No one was supposed to talk, no one was supposed to spend, no one was supposed to become visible in any way that made the operation real to the outside world. Cash had to sit, calls had to shorten, familiar places had to be approached carefully or not at all. The order was simple because it had to be. Survive the attention. This was the true test of loyalty inside a disciplined criminal system. Not whether a man could participate in the daring moment, but whether he could tolerate the dead air afterward. Silence is harder than action. Silence gives fear time to grow. Silence forces every participant to sit with what he knows, what he suspects, and what he imagines others might say first. In that quiet, paranoia becomes its own chain of command. Men begin judging each other's faces, schedules, excuses, and absences. A network built on secrecy becomes a network built on mutual surveillance. And once that happens, nobody is merely a partner anymore. Everyone becomes a potential witness. The insider at the center of the danger was especially vulnerable because he carried more than knowledge. He carried appetite. He had the sort of role that makes a man believe he is protected by his usefulness, even when his usefulness is exactly why people are measuring him. He understood laundering functions, knew how money could be softened, disguised, rerouted, and introduced back into ordinary life. He knew which fronts could absorb pressure, which relationships could cover delay, which explanations sounded plausible when cash needed a respectable story. That knowledge gives a man a private sense of power. It also gives him the illusion that he can bend rules designed for everyone else. Old loyalty deepens the illusion. When a system has depended on you long enough, it is easy to confuse dependence with affection. Easy to think history will save you. Easy to think a favour done years ago is still sitting somewhere in the ledger, but criminal structures rarely keep emotional books. They keep risk books. The insider did not understand that fast enough, or he understood it only when understanding no longer helped. The visible trigger in many retellings was not a confession or a fingerprint. It was a celebration, a gift, a purchase, something bright enough to announce that someone inside the locked room had mistaken temporary success for permanent safety. That is what made the moment feel fatal. The object itself mattered less than what it signaled. In a world that survives by staying ordinary, conspicuous reward is a form of disobedience. Flash is not just vanity. Flash is proof that discipline has failed. It tells every careful observer that money has already started moving in the wrong direction. It tells the gatekeeper that orders have been ignored, and ignored orders mean uncontrolled variables. The room changes when that happens. Conversations shorten, eyes linger. The celebration curdles into audit. What should have remained invisible has taken physical form, and once it can be pointed at, it can be judged. In organizations built on quiet, the loudest object in the room can become a death sentence long before anyone says so aloud. That is why the symbol mattered more than the thing itself. An expensive item, a flashy reward, an indulgence out of step with the official posture. None of it had to be evidence in a courtroom to become evidence inside the organization. It was enough that it suggested movement, enough that it implied someone felt rich too early, safe too early, entitled too early. Criminal systems like this do not fall because every participant turns reckless at once. They weaken because one breach teaches everyone else what cannot be contained anymore. Once one person is seen enjoying what should still be hidden, others begin calculating what he must know, what he must have taken, and what he might say if pressure lands first on him. Symbols compress suspicion into certainty. They turn rumour into pattern. They make invisible money suddenly feel visible to the people most afraid of visibility. In that sense, the celebration was not an afterthought to the score. It was part of the fallout. The operation had succeeded. Now the men behind it had to survive success. And survival was already starting to fail. The breach widened because private disclosures rarely stay private in frightened circles. A confidant hears one detail, then another. A spouse notices a change in spending, a change in mood, a change in who is allowed through the door. A friend hears enough to recognize panic, even if the facts remain incomplete. The insider at the center of the storm did what compromised men often do. He tried to divide his life into compartments after the walls between those compartments had already come down. He wanted comfort without exposure, reassurance without consequence. But once a secret has to be explained at home, it is no longer moving only through the channels the organization controls. That matters. It matters because criminal discipline depends on narrow lines of information. The moment risk spills into emotional life, it becomes harder to manage. Fear changes tone. Loyalty changes shape. The organization can watch a partner. It cannot fully predict what he says when he is trying to calm someone he loves, impress someone close to him, or convince someone that everything is still under control. Personal disclosure is not just weakness, it is leakage. Then suspicion hardened into something worse. It was no longer simply a question of who had talked or spent unwisely. Now there were whispers of skimming, of self-enrichment, of side-taking around the money flow itself. That accusation changes everything because it strips away the final argument for mercy. A frightened participant can still be useful. A careless participant can still be warned. But a man believed to be helping himself from the center of the score becomes a double threat. He is both exposed and disloyal. In a system built on selective trust, there is no more dangerous combination. The insider may have still believed he could explain. He may have thought old relationships, past service, or partial denials could slow the judgment forming around him. But by then, the arithmetic had changed. He was no longer being measured against friendship. He was being measured against what would happen if he were arrested, cornered, abandoned, or simply offended. Men who know the money routes are dangerous. Men who know them and are believed to be taking extra become intolerable. Panic followed, and panic is where many criminal stories stop pretending to be about control. The insider began avoiding certain places, then returning to them, staying close to familiar faces, then drifting away from them, reaching out in ways that looked like caution to him and like betrayal to everyone watching. In stories like this, the line between self-protection and active threat is thin and moves fast. A man asks too many questions. He asks the wrong person for assurance. He tries to feel out whether protection exists elsewhere, in lawyers, in intermediaries, in authorities, in the simple hope that another power structure might keep him alive if his own no longer will. Even the attempt can be enough. He does not need to complete the turn. He only needs to look like someone thinking about it. That is how a shaky insider becomes an immediate problem. Not because he has already spoken in full, but because everyone around him now has to imagine the day he might. Underworld logic is ruthless in exactly that way. possibility can be punished like fact when the cost of waiting feels too high. By the time the final call came, the ending had narrowed to ritual. The summons can arrive as a meeting, a message, an invitation to talk things through, one last chance to smooth over tension. Men answer those calls for complicated reasons. Some still believe in hierarchy. Some still believe history counts for something. Some know the trap and go anyway because refusing it would make the verdict official before they even stood up. That is the tragedy of the final summons. It works partly because the condemned man understands the rules well enough to recognize the danger and badly enough to imagine there might still be a path through it. He gets dressed. He rides across the city. He rehearses explanations that sounded stronger in a quiet room than they do under fluorescent light and watchful faces. Every step toward the meeting is both voluntary and coerced. That contradiction is the mark of organizations like this. They do not always need to drag a man to his ending. Sometimes they only need to make him believe that not showing up would be even worse. What happened next entered the record not as clarity but as absence. A route half traced, a sighting never fully secured. A vehicle remembered by one account and doubted by another. The disappearance itself stayed powerful because it left just enough uncertainty to keep the machine larger than any one explanation. He was there, then he was gone. That was enough. In cities shaped by long criminal memory, disappearance can be more intimidating than a public body count. It proves that the organization can erase not only a person, but the confidence others have in their own ability to reconstruct events. Family members wait. Associates go quiet. Investigators work around holes that feel less like missing details than deliberate blank space. The man at the center of the danger does not become a solved event. He becomes a warning, a boundary line, a lesson every surviving participant is meant to absorb without needing it explained twice. The system has answered the breach in the language it trusts most: removal. What followed after the removal was the kind of ambiguity that protects power, even while it corrodes reputations. There were disposal accounts, grim and efficient, the sort of explanations built to sound consistent with how organizations manage liabilities. There were competing theories as well, each filling the evidence gap with a different version of inevitability. That gap mattered. It still matters in stories like this, because uncertainty can become part of the legend. Too much confidence risks making the story brittle. Too little leaves it shapeless. The most enduring Underworld narratives live in the space between those extremes. Enough pattern to feel true, enough darkness to remain unresolved. What can be said is that once the insider vanished, the organization regained a form of internal order. Fear settled where argument had been, questions shortened, memory itself became selective. People remembered what was safe to remember. They forgot what forgetting could save them from having to explain. And the city, as cities do, kept functioning around that silence. But the disappearance was never only about one man. It was a window into the broader purge that success had set in motion. Once the first liability was removed, the logic expanded. Loose ends were reconsidered. Weak links were reclassified as threats. Those who remained learned the old lesson again. Criminal empires do not merely reward loyalty, they consume it. The surviving witness, the peripheral narrator, the frightened associate who later tells a partial version of events, these figures matter because they reveal the scale of what vanished beyond the missing man himself. It was not just a body, or perhaps several bodies, or a missing share of money. It was trust. It was the illusion that proximity to power creates safety. It was the fantasy that a system capable of bending a city can be lived inside without eventually turning on its own operators. The gatekeepers survive more easily than the middlemen. That is another constant. The closer a person stands to execution rather than administration, the more replaceable he becomes once the cleanup begins. And that is how a criminal machine can seem to control part of Chicago for half a century and still leave so much unresolved behind it. Not by answering every accusation, but by outlasting them. Not by proving innocence, but by making proof difficult, witnesses scarce, and memory expensive. Justice, in the clean public sense, depends on visibility, sequence, and confidence. Systems like this survive by attacking all three. They blur sequence, they cloud visibility. They teach everyone nearby that confidence can get you isolated before it gets you believed. The result is a legacy built less on courtroom finality than on durable suspicion, a structure people could feel operating even when they could not fully map it. That may be the darkest measure of its success. It was not only the money taken, the lives broken, or the fear distributed through back rooms and city blocks. It was the space it carved between what many believed had happened and what could finally be pinned down. In the end, that may be the truest meaning of escaping justice. Not vanishing cleanly, but leaving behind a city full of consequences, and just enough missing pieces to keep the verdict forever incomplete.